Sean, my best friend, persuaded me to accompany them on their triennial trek to Mount Everest. I nearly opted out. For starters, I didn't have $50,000 to spend on a guided adventure, a climbing permit, and equipment. I'm not that kind of man, for one thing. The only exercise I got last year was walking from my flat to the 7-Eleven. However, after Tom had offered to pay for my portion of the trip, Daniel had snidely said, "You can even keep up. You are aware that everyone is out for themselves up there, correct?" That put an end to it. My entire life, Daniel and other guys have looked down on me. I found myself in this situation, lying in a hospital bed in Nepal. I am the sole survivor out of the 37 climbers who made it to Camp 3, C3, and spent the night, and that was pure luck. 2 hours after they arrived at C3, Bethany and Sandy left due to Sandy's high-altitude pulmonary edema symptoms, HAPE. The following day, Bethany informed the rescue personnel when no one answered to his radio call. Nearly 2,000 feet from where I had fallen, they discovered me. I narrowly survived with 2 cracked ribs, a damaged pelvis, and a concussion. Everyone believes that the other climbers were carried off by an avalanche. I'm here to be honest with you about what actually occurred on Everest. You don't need to be afraid of avalanches, crevasses, or falling ice. I climbed the first of the 3 ladders the Sherpas had positioned over the chasm slowly and carefully. The Khumbu Icefall, a river of ice dotted with imposing ice seracs and wide crevasses, was the subject of our 3rd rotation. If the weather allowed, we would spend the night in Camp 2, C2, spend the night at Camp 3, C3 the next day, spend 5 hours at Camp 4, also known as the South Col, and then make a push for the summit. Tom was 20 feet in front of me. 10 minutes prior, John, our head guide, and Sandy, our junior guide, had all passed us. John requested we stick together so he could watch over us. I made an effort not to think about how I was hindering the progress of the entire team. Except for me, everyone else had been to a high altitude, even if it had only been to the top of Mount Kilimanjaro. A sudden wind blast caused the ladder to shake under me, and my right crampon almost fell off. I saw me falling, my body continuously crashing against the icy walls of the abyss until I crashed in a mangled heap at the bottom, despite the fact that I was attached to the safety line. "Return to base camp," advised a lustful inner voice. Better still, return to Lukla Airport and leave immediately. I couldn't help but glance below, where I saw a brief movement. Under our ladder, something huge and pale clung to the cold crevasse's vertical walls. It quickly darted out of view as though it sensed my gaze on it. What the hell is going on? It almost resembled a person, to be honest. "How are you, Sloan?" I almost fell after all because I jerked. One of our team's 2 climbing Sherpas was Bethany. Bethany had stayed behind to keep tabs on us and guide us through the icefall. The Sherpas didn't seem to be impacted by the high altitude, while the rest of us were having trouble breathing. They were the real Everest climbers. They fixed the ropes, found the most direct and safe routes, and more. Numerous Sherpas also had legends associated with Everest, which they referred to as Chomolungma. They thought that its peak was home to the Buddhist goddess Myeongsangma. Some Sherpas even said that the mountain was plagued by ravenous ghosts who had never been humans. Others brought up the cases of climbers who vanished and whose remains were never discovered. In fact, finding Sherpa guides for our excursion this month had been challenging. Though he could throw a shit ton of cash at an issue, Daniel wasn't the kind of guy to accept a no. "Sloan? Do you need to descend again?" I became aware that I had been motionless for a few minutes. "I'm all right." I was not going to change my mind about what I thought I saw. I doubt Daniel would ever allow me to make amends. I had to let go of the tight grip I had on the ropes and go cautiously forward. Another follows. Then another. Even though my heart was still thumping madly in my chest, I had faith that I could reach the top. Probably. Maybe. Sloan, only one thing at a time. At the base of Lutza Face was C2. The tallest peak in the world, Everest, dominated the skyline, pushing her surrounding peaks aside. I was more than ready to pass out by the time we got to C2. I would have thrown myself to the ground and refused to move if my tent hadn't already been pitched for me. Past the roughly 80 other tents at C2, I made a beeline for it. After getting into my sleeping bag, I passed the fuck out. I was awakened in the middle of the night by a strange rustling sound. I initially thought I was imagining things. The roar of the wind, which sounded so much like the roar of the ocean, served as a calming background noise, and when the sound kept repeating, I almost dozed off again. This time it's louder. I looked about for my headlamp. Outside my tent, a crowd of people were pressing on it from all sides. Their hands' forms could be seen bending the nylon cloth. It took me a good minute to comprehend that Daniel had to be having sex with me as my throat tightened with fear. Daniel and his teammates from New Zealand pals. He has been making crude jokes about my lack of experience at high altitudes ever since the trip began. I became enraged and made the mistake of trying to leap to my feet while still half zipped inside my sleeping bag. Fuck. Everyone else had disappeared by the time I was able to escape from my tent. You guys are total dickheads, I shouted as I gazed out at the deserted snowfield. I noticed something odd about the ground beneath my tent as I turned around to head back inside. I tried to think about it, but I was too eager to feel warm again. I questioned why Tom even hung out with Daniel, not for the first time. Daniel was a trust fund dude bro who was constantly trying to outdo you, while Tom was a calm, thoughtful guy who was ashamed of his fortune. I told myself to let it go. He'll be reaching the summit of Everest in 3 days. I was able to control my emotions up until I saw Daniel sitting in our mess tent. I had received less than 3 hours of sleep due to Daniel's childish trick and John waking us up before sunrise once more. I approached his table with force. "Why did you mess with my tent last night?" Daniel twitched an earlobe. "What are you referring to?" "Last evening. You disturbed my tent." No. No, I didn't." He leaned in and flashed me a bright smile with lots of teeth. "Perhaps you ought to return to base camp. Angela, get checked out." Our base camp manager and physician was Angela. She gave us a lengthy presentation about the symptoms of hypnosis before we started our first rotation. She also discussed the danger of developing high-altitude psychosis. But what had happened last night had not been a hallucination. Anyway, I understood Daniel's motivation for suggesting it, and it had nothing to do with my well-being. He just didn't want me to make them go more slowly. I clenched my teeth and walked out of the tent, saying, "Forget it." I was frightened away by his laughter, and I almost collided with Sandy before she swiftly avoided me. Knowing that the tips of my ears were turning a blazing crimson, I murmured, "Sorry." Somehow up here, Sandy appeared even more gorgeous than she did at base camp. Daniel had spent the first 2 weeks of our vacation boasting to her about summiting Cho Oyu in Denali, despite her obvious disinterest, so I wasn't the only one who had seen her. She stated calmly, "John says it's time for us to climb Lutza," and gathered the others up. John started going over what to do if our oxygen pipes were knocked free or the valves on our oxygen canisters froze over. I ignored him because he had already covered the fundamentals of using bottled oxygen at base camp and chose to focus on the climb that lay in front of us. The Lutza face was a glacial blue ice wall that ascended at pitches between 40 and 50 degrees, occasionally with bulges of 80 degrees. After getting over them, it was a straightforward, hard ascent to C3 which pierced the face. The line to climb wasn't as long as it may have been because we had purposely kept our summit attempt a secret from everyone else. I made an effort to climb with a rhythm, kicking my crampons into the hard ice and using the jumpers to pull myself up, but I kept having to stop so that faster climbers could attach their carabiners to the rope in front of me. I finally understood what had been worrying me the previous night. Around halfway up the ascent, I hadn't noticed any footprints outside my tent. None besides my own. Possibly, Daniel was correct. Had I simply dreamed everything, much like how I had previously imagined seeing a man in the crevasse? No. No way. However, a sensation of anxiety surged over me and persisted long after I arrived at C3. As we watched the clouds roll into the western Coombe, the flat glacial valley we had just gone through yesterday, and the plumes floating off Everest's summit, the vista from C3 almost made the ascent worthwhile. For our tents to lay atop, Bethany and Dorje meticulously excavated out tiny terraces. They had picked a location that was elevated above the tents of the other teams, so we would begin the climbing tomorrow. In any case, there were only 3 other teams present, a second American squad, a Canadian team, and a New Zealand team. The smallest tasks, like strapping on my crampons or taking up my water bottle, became incredibly tough at 23,950 feet above sea level, as though massive weights had been strapped to my limbs. The artificial air from my oxygen canister had to be inhaled for 10 minutes before my brain was able to function normally once more. Each of us carried 6 bottles of oxygen, 3 for the ascent to the summit and 3 more for the descent. We would enter the death zone for the first time tomorrow evening at the South Kernel because the human body could no longer adjust to the absence of oxygen at that altitude. Our cells would start to perish from oxygen deprivation, hence the name. I hesitated whether or not to mention what I had seen the previous night as Tom and I entered the tent that we would be sharing moving forward. Would he advise me to return to base camp as well? But Tom broke the stillness first, before I could respond. "Man, I appreciate you coming with me." "You're welcome to be here." "Of course, yeah." I appreciate being invited. I'm sorry you had to pay for my portion of the trip. I chuckled awkwardly and tried to hide my uneasiness by looking down at my water bottle. How exactly did you start into mountaineering? I believe you detested heights. I was able to clearly recall our family's trip to Disney World together. Tom and I rode Space Mountain together when we were both 10 years old. He began shrieking uncontrollably as soon as the roller coaster began to move. Tom had a sheepish grin as if he was also thinking of Space Mountain. I do, yes. However, climbing is the best activity there is. It seems as though the rest of the world and all the nonsense melt away when you are here. Everything is clearer, perhaps frightening, but also more grounded in reality. I've never experienced this elsewhere. I was somewhat aware of his meaning. Base camp life was easier: climb, eat, sleep, repeat. And it was clear to me that the perils there would make reaching the summit all the more satisfying. John once said that scaling a mountain revealed your true nature by wearing you down until your defenses were completely gone. Before I could stop it, the question just exploded out of me. Do you honestly believe we'll succeed in the end? When we first arrived at base camp, I didn't care about summiting, I just didn't want to seem foolish. But now it seemed crazy to consider going back before reaching the peak. Yeah. We'll get there thanks to John and the Sherpas. Tom dozed out immediately away, but I kept dozing off and waking up. It would seem like hours had passed before I realized it was only 10 minutes. The oxygen mask seemed like it was being wrapped around my head in plastic. I had just started to close my eyes once more around 3 in the morning when I heard cries. Long, agonizing screams. Tom was shaken awake. Come on, it's time to leave. Something is wrong in the world. What are you referring to? I'm not sure. I gathered my flashlight and went outside. It took me a moment to realize what I was actually seeing. Blood. Everywhere. Additionally, dead climbers. The majority of them were hardly recognizable since something had crushed all the tents below us and torn them up like ragdolls. I sprinted toward a woman I knew who had slumped just a few steps from us. She belonged to the New Zealand squad. She had been ripped almost in half when I realized that maybe we weren't too late and we could bring her inside. The tattered edges of her shredded skin fluttered in the breeze, and her intestines spilled out in a mass of loops. Tom replied, a pale and drawn expression on his face, "We need to grab John." My focus kept returning to her extended arm, whose fingers were loosely curled into her palm. I struggled to make myself look elsewhere. Yes, but what about the rest of us? Sandy and Bethany's tent isn't visible to me. However, John has a radio in base camp. He will inform them of what transpired. He was correct, Sandy and Bethany's tent had disappeared. I didn't want to consider what that implied. While avoiding taking any more time than necessary to look around, I followed Tom to John and Dorje's tent. The body of the unnamed woman remained burnt in my memory, like a hole seared into a sheet of paper. Everyone in this room may already be dead, save for us. I had to bite the inside of my cheek until I could taste blood because the notion caused the world to tremble around me. Dumb since the cut couldn't heal at this altitude, but the pain kept me from falling. I heard a loud slurping sound, like someone was drinking a milkshake through a straw, as Tom opened John's tent. Tom moved out of my reach when I attempted to grab his arm. He cried out, "John, you must assist us. We require why." He halted talking when what was only a few steps away from us became clear in the light of his headlamp. The man I had convinced myself I had seen in the chasm the other day was hunched over a long, bloodied object. His complexion was a bloodless white, as pale as the snow on the ground, and he was dressed in worn, torn garments. He suddenly turned around, and I unconsciously took a step backwards because it wasn't a man after all. It is impossible. It had 2 silver quarters for eyes and a spherical disc for a mouth filled with pointed, angular teeth. It moved jerkily as it pounced at us. Tom threw me backwards as he turned to go, but it collapsed on him before he could react. He made a valiant effort to raise his arms to shield his face, but only partially succeeded. His right hand's fingers were severed, and blood gushed out of the stumps and onto the tent's roof. Tom gave a loud, terrible scream as it clamped its mouth around his neck. "Do something, for fuck's sake," my mind yelled at me. I stooped to my knees and crawled around the tent looking through the mess of items. Right as I discovered the ice axe partially buried inside John's ripped sleeping blanket, Tom's screams were cut off. I got it in about 30 seconds, max, but when I turned around, Tom and the item were gone. I was directed to the spot where the tent's back had been ripped open by a long trail of blood. Tom! I sprinted outside and made an effort to gaze everywhere at once. But he was not to be found. I only saw John. What remained of him? His lower jaw was gone, and the tiniest, most tenuous piece of muscle that still attached his half-severed tongue to it was nestled in the pit of his throat. I persisted going in circles around our tents until I was back in the lead. It had begun to snow, making visibility much more difficult. Knowing that something was waiting in the shadows and skulking around made the space between my shoulder blades ache. My shoulder was stroked by something. When I turned around and swung the axe with fear coursing through me, Daniel was staring back at me with wide-open, terrified eyes. He dodged just in time for me to lose balance and the axe's point to miss. He yelled, "What the fuck is wrong with you?" I disregarded it. "Have you heard from Tom lately?" "No. You fucking lunatic, I haven't seen anyone else than you. I just went outside after hearing cries." He dragged his feet before shoving me up against the tent. "What just happened?" "You did this, right?" I started to explain to him that I hadn't done anything when a dreadful ringing screech interrupted me and made my words unnecessary. The previous object was still hanging to the ice wall 10 feet above us when we looked up. Since there were no handholds or footholds on the ice, it should have been impossible, but it kept its position without seeming to try. Our eyes met, and I was certain it was looking at me at that same moment. Actually observing me, it laughed at me with a hideous grimace that transformed its features into a distorted parody of the human face, and its silver eyes sparkled with deceptive slyness. It jumped. Before I had a chance to protect myself, the force of its weight knocked me to the ground and tore the axe from my hands. I barely stopped it from biting a chunk of flesh out of my cheek as it pounced forward like a slithering snake. But I couldn't resist it for much longer. My fingers slowly but surely slipped off its face. I flinched away ineffectively as it reared back for another assault, its lamprey mouth expanding impossibly wide. The tip of an axe suddenly thrust out of its right eye and through the back of its head, changing the expression on its face and causing it to round into a shocked "oh." I struggled to get out from under it. Daniel was standing over me with a frown on his face. 100 nails scraping down 100 chalkboards caused it to screech once more, and this time I realized that it was speaking to me. Talking. It writhed helplessly on its back like an inverted bug as black viscous fluid flowed out of its punctured eye. Then it trembled all over and started to decompose, with the hair falling out of a dried-out skull, the skin loosening off the bones and shriveling, and the eyes sinking into their sockets. Furthermore, it continued, toenails peeled off, teeth fell out one by one, and bones broke and crumbled into dust, just for another gust of wind to scatter the entire collection of dusty fragments across the snow. Everything happened so swiftly that it was already gone when I stood up. Daniel, trembling, questioned, "What was that thing?" He no longer resembled the haughty asshole who had spent the entire trip provoking me. Instead, he resembled a young child who had just realized that the monsters in his closet were real. "No clue. But we must leave immediately. Now." I had a fleeting thought of Tom, who may still be alive, but I knew better. Nobody could have lost so much blood and continued to live, at least not without receiving prompt medical care. Do you want to know what the worst part of it is? After accepting the truth that he was dead and that I had just lost my best friend of more than 12 years, my brain began calculating the likelihood that I would live long enough to return to base camp. A cacophony of terrible screeches resounded throughout the night as though to emphasize my statements. We exchanged a silent glance before taking off. I ran by the unidentified dead woman to my right as she appeared to be cynically winking at us. "You can flee, but it won't help." One of her eyelids had popped open, but the other one was still gummed shut. If I had thought the climb was challenging before, it was nothing compared to the situation when my life was in danger. My only options were to drive my crampons into the firm blue ice and cling to the face against the wind's attempts to pry me off. I did not have enough time to secure myself to the anchored rope. I would drop more than 5,000 feet, so it wouldn't be a soft, pleasant landing if I did. Only God knew where I would finish up. I had been overtaken by Daniel, but he began muttering obscenities. As they fell, rocks clattered. He yelled, "Go back up. Go up." I looked to my feet. In the pitch black, silvery pinpoints of light sparkled and moved quickly toward us. There were possibly 6 or 8 more of those things, and they were all moving in our direction. They split out in a line so that we couldn't climb past them as they skittered over the steep ice bulges of the face with ease. We could only move upwards, to the edge of death. The slope above C3 had a sharp angle, far sharper than I had imagined. My calves trembled with exhaustion, my breath kept getting short, and my head ached from exhaustion despite pushing myself to climb as swiftly as I could. Daniel was closely following me and frantically gasping for air. The odd, guttural shrieks, screeches, and hisses that made up their language became increasingly audible the closer those entities came to us. They had moved to within 5 feet of us. I waited for a claw-tipped hand to enclose itself around my ankle in an iron grip, while my gut constricted with terror. Nothing took place. They ought to have overtaken us by now, but they were taking their time. Regressing, allowing us to carry on ascending. I discovered the solution in their gleeful, ferocious faces. As there was no escape. What would happen even if we managed to climb the South Col in 6 hours and managed to stay ahead of them the entire way up to the summit? With nowhere else to go but up, what would we do when we reached the top? What are our options? We can't keep going up, you say. I yelled at Daniel. I began to scurry in a diagonal direction, away from the regular path. Risking death by falling into a fissure was necessary in order to avoid being severed from head to toe. They continued to scream throughout the night, and I knew without turning around that they had altered their direction to pursue us. We tripped over an ankle-breaking combination of snow, ice, and rocks as the slope ultimately leveled off with Daniel taking the lead. My eyes began to water and the world became hazy as my body attempted to adapt to the lack of air. I noticed a group of huge boulders ahead. Perhaps we could hide behind them. Maybe. One of them suddenly scampered forward on all fours to obstruct our passage. The other 5 formed a spherical ring around us. They appeared to be regular men and women from behind. But when they turned to face you, the illusion vanished completely. The same strange silver eyes and lamprey mouths were shared by all of them. They all had the same expressions of malice. I looked across at Daniel, who was holding a spare ice axe. I indicated it, but he moved away and shook his head instead of offering me one. Since the beginning of our trip, he had been repeating the phrase, "It's every man for himself up here," so he didn't even have to say it out loud. I also ran out of time to persuade him. They started to play with us as they darted forward one at a time. Without a weapon, my only option was to try to avoid them, which I failed to accomplish. One of them feinted to the left before turning to swing for my throat. I tripped over and cried out in fear. A loose flap of flesh that was dangling down almost to my breast was felt when I hesitantly touched my throat. Just as I stumbled back to my feet, Daniel swung both of his axes at another one. It caught the head of the axe without even attempting, darting underneath with the ease of someone who has practiced this maneuver 1,000 times. Its other arm appeared with lightning-fast agility and tore open his abdomen. Daniel shouted and then fell to the ground, crossing his arms over himself for safety. As the space surrounding us grew smaller, I realized that I was going to perish in this location. We were going to perish here together. They were moving toward us, their eyes blazing with bloodlust, and I tried to steel myself. A loud whump came from a distance above us. The creatures stopped, their faces abruptly changing to one of caution. At first, until the snow started to move under my feet, my oxygen-starved brain was unable to comprehend what was occurring. I stumbled over to Daniel and attempted to lift him. His blood had seeped into the snow beneath him as he lay face down. Just as I finished calling his name, a huge snow wave launched us ahead. I fell over backwards, unable to distinguish between up and down as the white ground and star-studded sky blurred into an incoherent muddle. We were dragged down the slope by the snow, and I just managed to grasp onto Daniel. Our descent was unexpectedly stopped by something hard and sharp that painfully hit my right side. A mountain. I was pressed up against Daniel's body, stuck there. Screaming made my side hurt even more, and I had to bite my lip to keep from whimpering as I was trying to stop it. Even though the entire incident only lasted for approximately 40 seconds, the snow had already completely engulfed us and those other objects. It was completely dark. How deep did we go below the surface? 6 feet or 6 inches? I was unaware and breathing was painful. Before the ice solidified and blocked any further movement, I had to take action before it was too late. To create an air pocket, I knocked the snow away from our lips and noses. Now that the boulder had likely saved us from getting buried much further, I had to be thankful for it. How long, though, would our air supply remain? Time was meaningless. Hours, or even minutes, passed slowly. It was difficult to think of things I might never get the chance to do again, like seeing my parents, hanging out with my friends, and returning to school to get my master's degree, but I tried to remain calm because worrying would just squander our limited air supply. I wished not to pass away here. I had no desire to pass away. But if I didn't make a decision in the next few seconds, I would, and very soon. I compelled myself to contact Daniel. His pulse was thready and feeble, and his skin was cold to the touch, yet he was breathing nonetheless. I could try to find a way out for both of us, but I'd probably fail. Or, I forced my swallow. When I ran my fingers over his back, I briefly believed that it had become loose and was lost forever, just like mine had. However, it was still there, albeit dented on one side. His supply of oxygen. As I started to take Daniel's mask off, he made a feeble effort to resist. "Why are you doing that?" He stumbled and sounded hoarse. Despite his best efforts, neither of us could move very far due to the intense pressure caused by the snow's weight. And a lot of blood had been lost by Daniel. I was unable to react because I was out of breath. I attached my own mask as quickly as I could to the canister and breathed deeply of the manufactured, tinny air. I'd never felt better in my entire life, yet it was so cold that breathing it in stung my throat. Daniel attempted desperately to take his oxygen canister back from me, but I did my best to ignore him. As his breathing stopped, his throat rattled as if he were choked. I had no power to help him in any way. Both of us would have died. Up here, it was each guy for himself,